I'm going to be talking today about theory and history, and so as you might expect, the book I'm going to be emphasizing is the book by Mises, Theory and History, which came out in 1957. Theory and History was the last of Mises' four major works. The four most important books by Mises are Theory of Money and Credit, which came out in 1912, Socialism, which originally was published in 1922, Human Action in 1949, and then Theory and History in 1957. Now, when we talk about history, there are two things that we can mean by history. One is the events that take place in the past. Say we can talk, about the history of the France during a certain period, the history of the French Revolution, origins of World War I, what took place leading to World War I. We're talking about particular events in history, but history can also refer to the writing of history, the activity that the historian engages in. So when we're concerned with philosophy of history, which is the subject of the book Theory and History, the theory of history, there are two aspects of this. We can be concerned with the philosophy of the particular historical events that have taken place, or we can be talking about topics that involve the historian's activity in writing about those events. So what I first want to do is talk about philosophy of history in the first sense I mentioned, where we'll be talking about the various events in the past. In particular, there are some historians who haven't been satisfied with writing about particular events, or even even events on a very large scale, say something like the history of modern Europe. That hasn't been enough for them. They think that there's some pattern to history as a whole. There's some general understanding of the whole of history. History follows a certain path, a certain order that we can understand. So why was Mises concerned with this? Well, as it turns out, a lot of the philosophers of history, in this sense I've just distinguished, have been opponents of capitalism. They oppose the free market, or they've argued that the free market, capitalism, is if it had any validity, would just be true at one stage of history. It's been transcended by future developments. So Mises naturally wanted to refute these theories, because very often in philosophy, the part that interested him the most was how he could reply to critics of philosophy. Remember in lectures I mentioned in previous lectures, you've heard about the logical positivists. The principal reason Mises was concerned with them was that many of them were opponents of capitalism, and he thought the method of philosophy they favored would, if it were right, would strike at the sort of economics he supported. So because of that, he addressed them critically and tried to refute them. So in a similar way, he was concerned to talk about what was wrong with philosophies of history that had gone against capitalism. I want to mention two philosophers of history that he attacked in Theory and History, and go into his criticisms in some detail. The first, who was the most famous, I think, of anyone who's come up with these general schemes of trying to explain all history, is Karl Marx. Now, to say that Mises was an opponent of Marx is somewhat of an understatement. It would be saying something like Walter Block is not all too together enthusiastic about Rudy Giuliani. It was probably Mises was the foremost opponent of any of Marx, of anyone who's ever written on Marx. Now, Marx's theory of history was, of course, is expressed most famously in his book Das Kapital, which first volume came out in 1867, but in a number of other works as well. And Mises, in his interpretation of Marx, his view was very much influenced by the Russian Marxist Plekhanov. Let me see if I can write on this. I got the. Is this the right pen? Oh, no, I'm almost using the marker to write on. I'm not very good at these things. Oh, I have to press the button. Oh, this is too technological for me. Oh, good work. Good work. Okay. So Plekhanov had a well-known book called Development of the Monist Conception of History. The interpretation that he gives of Marx's theory of history is very much the one Mises uses, although of course he's in favor of it and Mises is against it. Another book that gives a similar view is one by the G.A. Cohen. This is a more recent book called Karl Marx's Theory of History, a Defense. Cohen is one of the best of the so-called analytical Marxists. He's my favorite Marxist, as a matter of fact. He's a professor of Oxford. I think his biggest weakness is that he doesn't think my jokes are funny, although he's in the majority there. He's very much in the majority. So according to the view that Mises, and again this is a interpretation is also found in Plekhanov and Cohen, has the basic theme of Marx's theory of history is that the material productive forces, the growth of material productive forces is the most important determinant of world history. By the material productive forces, Marx meant roughly the technology that was available at a particular time. He says he thought that the technology, the material productive forces, had a constant tendency throughout history to keep growing and increasing. Say we start off with the stone, we have in the Stone Age, we have very primitive tools, and then we have tools have kept going on and on, becoming more and more developed throughout the history of the world. Marx thought this is an inevitable tendency. Technology, the force of production, are going to keep growing throughout history. This is not anything. People don't have any choice about this. Material productive forces are just going to keep going on and on. Now, Marx holds that as these forces of production develop, there'll be what he calls relations of production at various times that will best develop the forces of production. The relations of production are really the economic system that exists at the time, particularly by relation of production, he's concerned especially with the classes that exist. Say we have in the ancient world, the Greeks and Romans, slavery was the dominant system. And in the Middle Ages, feudalism is the economic system, the relation of production. Then we have capitalism is the system prevailing now, and then this will be replaced, he thinks, by socialism. There are two stages of socialism. There's the lower stage in which people are rewarded according to what they produce, and then in the higher stage, full communism really will have the famous slogan, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Really, anyone will be able to get really whatever he wants. People won't have to technology will be developed so much that people won't really have to labor much to get all that they want. This is really the final development of histories. Will get full communism. So in the basic point here, though, is each stage, each system that I mentioned, the slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, is at that particular point in the development of the force of production, the system that's best suited to develop those forces of the forces of production at that time. Say, if we try to introduce, Marx thinks socialism is the best system, but if we tried to introduce socialism at the time of the Romans, it just wouldn't have worked. That wouldn't be, we didn't have socialism then, because socialism then wouldn't have been developed the forces of production in the appropriate way, the best way. It's only when after capitalism has developed the force of production as far as it can, that then that system will be transcended and we'll have socialism. Now, what Marx further thought was, at each stage of production, at each stage in the force of production, we have a system that best develops those forces. We have the relations of production, best develop the force of production. Now, as the forces of production keep going, it won't be true anymore that the relations of production best develop the force of production. It's they did for a while, but then they'll stop. They won't develop the force of production in the best way possible. As Marx puts it in Das Kapital, they now become fetters or chains on the force of production, where formerly they were the system in which they could best develop. So when that happens, then the class that was not in the inferior position in the system will overthrow the system and put in a new system. Say in the feudal system was dominated by the aristocrats, so as that system was unable to develop the force of production anymore in the best way possible, the rising bourgeoisie overthrew the aristocratic feudal order, replaced it with the capitalist system. So you see, according to Marx, at each stage we have the system first force of production are best suited to the relations of production. I mean, the relation of production best suited to the force of production. That's only true for a certain length of time. Then we have the new time in which the relation of production are now fettering the old system. So then we have a revolutionary overthrow until we have then a new system. This will continue until the final stage, socialism. Then we, according to Marx, we won't have any more revolutions. That's the ultimate goal of history. Now, so far we have the relations of production, forces of production, forces of production, relation of production. Now, we have now those constitute what Marx called the base, the forces in relation of production, so the base. Then he says, on this base we have the superstructure, which is the ideology, the legal system, the philosophy and religion that are prevailing at a particular time. These are determined by the base, the forces of production and the relation of production. So we have, according to Marx, say we have economic theory under capitalism. This is the reason economists favor capitalism isn't that they've investigated matters scientifically and determine that capitalism is the best system. No, it's because at that stage they're determined to favor capitalism because it's determined by the relation of production. Specifically, they're the agents of the ruling class. They're the ideologists of the ruling class will support the system that dominates at the time. And in like fashion, Marx held that the state is really an instrument of the ruling class that can aid it in its rule. As Mises was naturally had a great deal of many objections to this, it reminded me a little bit of a cartoon I once saw where someone was making fun of those pictures where puzzles where you're shown two pictures and you have to find out you're shown a picture and you have to see what's wrong with this picture. There'll be some detail that's wrong, like something hanging upside down. So someone once did a parody where almost every detail in the picture had something wrong with it, and the caption is, "What's right with this picture?" So this is a bit like, this is really what Mises' attitude to Marx is. He's completely against everything that Marx supported. Now, the most fundamental criticism, I think, that Mises raises in Theory and History of Marxist system has to do with something that I mentioned in an earlier lecture. I'm sure you've heard in other lectures. The principle he called methodological individualism. Now, you remember, according to, remember we have in human action the basic axiom of action that all human beings act. And remember, Mises holds that only human beings act. There aren't group minds or larger forces that act. It wouldn't make sense, say if we said, it wouldn't make sense to say, this room is giving a lecture. It's bad enough that I'm giving one, let alone this room. So, I mean, if you want to say something like if we say the United States is at war with Iraq, this has to be analyzed by looking at particular actions of people. So we say President Bush gave certain orders to certain other people. As a result, various events are taking place in Iraq. So remember, only, according to Mises, and I think he's obviously right here, only individuals can act. Now, we can see that Marx's system violates this principle in the most fundamental way possible, because you remember what I mentioned was the big thesis that Marx, the dominant theme in its entire interpretation, is that the forces of production have a tendency to keep growing by themselves. You imagine, it isn't that individuals are deciding to increase the force of production at various times, because then we could say maybe at some times they wouldn't do that. Marx thinks there's an inevitable tendency, the forces of production are just going to keep growing and growing by themselves. So Marx has in effect taken the forces of production as if it were some acting entity, as if it were a person who was acting, and it obviously isn't. What Marx has really done is he's taken in Hegel's philosophy. Hegel had the notion that mind or spirit, which is develops throughout history. Marx has given a materialist touch to this and said, no, it's the forces of production or the independent entity that is developing throughout history, and this is completely wrong because it's only individuals that can act. In fact, Marx at one point, and Mises mentioned this, Marx comments on the French philosopher and writer in economics, Joseph Proudhon. Proudhon had said, machinery is a development of the division of labor. As the division of labor develops, then people have the idea of using machines more and more. And Marx said, isn't this ridiculous that it's machines that come first? The division of labor comes after development of machines. And Mises says, well, it's actually Marx, not Proudhon, who's being ridiculous here, because it isn't that the machines are developing by themselves, it's that human beings have the idea of developing tools and machinery, not the other way around. So Mises is right, the fundamental point of the theme of the Marxist system is really completely overthrown. Now, it isn't enough for Mises to demolish the fundamental theme. He attacks him on all sorts of other points as well. It's a bit like saying, if you watch professional wrestling, I'm afraid I've done that from time to time, it's not enough, say, when they knock somebody down, they have to keep stomping them for another half hour. This is a bit the way Mises does it with Marx. So we could call Mises, in fact, the Luthez of anti-Marxism. One of the most basic points that Mises criticizes Marx is that he gets at the culminating stage of the Marxist system. Remember, according to Marx, the force of production keep developing. Capitalism will develop the force of production to the greatest extent possible, but then the forces of production will develop so much that capitalism is unable to sustain the force of production to the greatest extent possible. The capitalist system now becomes feder on the development of force of production. And then we have the new system, socialism, which is best fitted to develop the force of production. Now, you can see, I'm sure this has been discussed in other lectures, how if Mises economics completely overthrows this, because Mises is showing his socialist calculation argument the socialist system couldn't work at all. So remember, according to the socialist calculation argument, if you have a developed complex economy, the producers need to know how to use the various production goods, how they're to be most efficiently allocated. Say we have a list of consumer goods, what the people want to have was produced in the economy. We have a choice in deciding how to produce these goods. This isn't determined purely by technology. We have a choice, say, suppose we have steel, we have a choice. Are we going to use the steel, say, for buildings, or are we going to perhaps use steel as they used to do, I think, in Russia under communism? Are they going to use them for filling people's teeth? How are they going to use these various products? There has to be some means of allocating production goods efficiently to produce the consumer goods we want. Mises argued that only a market system would be able to do this. A socialist system, centrally directed economy, would have no means of gathering up all the information needed to make these decisions and using this in an efficient way. So if we take note of the socialist calculation argument, we then get the conclusion that far from developing the force of production to a greater extent than capitalism did, socialism wouldn't work at all. So if we add, that was kind of interesting, if we add the socialist calculation argument to Marx's system, say we leave Marx's system otherwise undisturbed, but add the socialist calculation argument, then we get a Marxist argument for capitalism, because we'd have capitalism would be developing the force of production to the greatest extent possible, and no other system would be better than it. So we get, actually there is one Marxist economist in England, Meghnad Desai, who's really accepted this. He says, well, capitalism really is going to be the prevailing system for centuries, because as far as we know, in existing conditions, capitalism is going to develop the forces of production to the greatest extent possible. This point on when socialism, when the capitalism had developed the force of production to the greatest extent possible, is actually was at the heart of the dispute in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which was the Marxist party in Russia, leading to the famous split at the 1903 conference in Belgium between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. The Mensheviks, who were actually, Menshevik means minority in Russian, but they were actually in the majority in that Congress, but they were actually the majority in the party, although they were outvoted at that conference. They thought you can only have socialism when the force of production have developed under capitalism. It wasn't time yet for Russia, but the Bolsheviks said, no, we should have a revolution first. So this point, if you pushed it further, you'd get socialism postponed to the very, very indefinite future. We would have a Marxist argument either for not having socialism for centuries or not having it at all. Now, there's a further related criticism, I think, one can give a Misesian criticism of Marxism, which is that why does Marx think that, say, at their stages of history in which capitalism isn't the best system, why is it in the ancient world the slavery is the best system or feudalism is the best system in the Middle Ages? If we take note of what economics is established in the work of the Austrian Economics, we would get that capitalism is the most efficient system overall. I mean, even if one didn't accept Austrian economics, it's still the case that Marx never shows why at each stage that the system that he says is the most efficient is in fact the most efficient. Why does he say that slavery is the most efficient system production for the force of production as they were in the ancient world? He really doesn't give us any argument for that. Now, I want to turn to a different philosopher of history, one with very different indeed, Oswald Spengler. He had a book, his most famous book was called The Decline of the West. The first volume came out in 1970, then the second volume, I think, was 1920. It was translated into English by, it was a German book, but translated into English by, I think, Charles Francis Atkinson in the early 1920s. Have any of you read Spengler's book? Oh, that's unfortunate, because I was hoping nobody had, so I would be able to say anything I wanted about it. I'll have to try to be accurate now. Oh, well, there's always a first time. Spengler had a view of history that was very different from Marx. Remember, Marx's theories, I've explained it as a linear view. We start off with slavery, then we go to feudalism, then capitalism and socialism. It's a progressive view. The stages are supposed to keep getting higher and higher. Now, Spengler rejected this linear conception of history. He said this is completely wrong. What he said are they're separate, what he called high cultures. He distinguished 8 of the high cultures. He said each culture goes through a life cycle, just like a plant. Say a plant will start off with a seed, and then it'll keep blossom, and then it will reach its full maturity, and then it'll wither and eventually die. So Spengler thought that each of the high cultures will develop in the same way. He takes a culture as if it's an organism. It's not, again, individuals who are really the most important aspect in Spengler's theory. It's the culture is a whole or entity that develops according to certain principles on its own. Each culture, according to him, has a particular symbol that's the dominant theme in that culture. For example, one of the culture in the ancient world, dominant theme was he called the present particular. What he meant by what he meant by that was that in the ancient world, in Greece and Rome, that people emphasized closed space. They didn't have the real notion of infinity. What was important was just the immediate time that was close to them. For example, he makes the claim that in the ancient world didn't really have the notion of history as we understand it. They, of course, did have great historians such as Thucydides and Herodotus, but according to Spengler, these historians didn't have the notion that their own history was just part of some vast panorama of events that have taken place throughout the world. They were just one culture among many. Spengler thought, say he mentions that when Thucydides is writing about the Peloponnesian War, he thinks this is the most significant event in all of history because he has this very local perspective. This is very much in contrast with our modern Western culture, in which he says that there's a Faustian element. The notion of infinite striving is the dominant theme. So Spengler tries to show that every aspect of a culture is determined by this dominant theme. He has in a famous chapter of Decline in the West in the first round called The Reality of Numbers, and he says that even mathematics is different for the various cultures. Now, each culture, after it develops to its highest stage, will decay into what he calls a civilization. And when we have in the civilization, we'll have a rise of mass movements and domination by democracy and money, and this will be overthrown by the reign of the Caesars. Eventually we'll have dictators coming to power, and then eventually, after they take power, the culture will they will go on for a while, and the culture will eventually die. He thought that these high cultures will last for about 1,000 years, although this can vary from depending on how particular events transpire. So we have this, instead of having a linear system, we have these separate high cultures that are developing as biological organisms. Now, again, to mention something I said earlier, Mises was concerned about this theory because Spengler was very much opposed to capitalism. He thought, he had another book called Prussianism and Socialism, where he said, although, of course, he was opposed to Marxism, this was mainly because Marxism was an internationalist system, a national version of socialism, he thought, was very congenial to the Prussian character, and he was sympathetic to that, although in some of his later essays that Mises doesn't mention, he backtracks somewhat from that, and he says he was misunderstood. I should say Spengler wasn't a supporter of the Nazis. He had an interview with Hitler in 1933, and he wasn't very impressed with Hitler. Spengler said, we need a genuine hero, not a heroic tenor. That was his comment on Hitler. And in his last book, which was called, in English, The Hour of Decision, although the German title is The Year of Decision, although it started off as a bestseller in Germany, it was eventually banned by the Nazis. But so Spengler, then, although he wasn't a Nazi, he was very much a nationalist and an opponent of capitalism. So this is why Mises wanted to refute him. Now, you can probably, from what I've said about Marxism, guess what Mises' basic criticism of Spengler is going to be, is that he also is violating the principle of methodological individualism, because he's saying that these high cultures are organisms that are just developing by themselves. It isn't that individuals are acting in certain ways, and as a result we have certain cultural patterns. No, it's the culture is an organism that's really acting by itself, and this is very much not compatible with the basic principles of human action. Now, there's another fallacy in Spengler's system that Mises emphasized, and this one is also found in the Marxist system. Well, you remember the term, I think Roderick Long mentioned this in his lecture, polylogism. Polylogism is the view that it's not the case that all human beings use the same logical system. People think in various different ways. Say, Spengler held that each culture has a different way of reasoning, different mathematics. As I mentioned, according to him, the Greeks didn't have the concept of infinity. This is something that came in only in much later. The logic is different from in the various different cultures. Marx also has this, incidentally, since he thinks that the various classes think in different ways. It's unclear to what extent Marx thought that this view applies to logic, but he certainly did think that it applies to most disciplines that are determined by one's class membership rather than by any universal principles of science. So Mises rejects this entirely. He said everyone reasons in the same way. He says, well, if you deny this, he said, first, he'd like to see what are these supposed different logics. He'd like to see some example of one set out so he could comment on it, but no one who says that, none of these writers ever set out a different system of logic. They just say people reason a different way, but they don't set out logic. I think we can see Mises is, as usual, correct on the point. If people really did use a different method of reasoning, we wouldn't be able to understand them at all. The very fact we can understand other cultures shows that they can't be using a different way of reasoning from the one that we do. If Spengler were right that each culture has an independent way of thought, how would he have been able to describe all these different cultures, given that he himself is in the Western culture? The system is rather self-refuting in that way. So Mises then said Spengler's system be rejected, not only for violating methodological individualism, but also because it's a polylogous system. Now, I mentioned two writers who written on philosophy of history. Now, I now want to, in the time remaining, I now want to say something about the other sense of history I mentioned, which is not the events themselves, but the activity of the historian in explaining historical events. Mises has some very valuable comments on this as well. One topic I think is very important is how can the historian who's familiar with Austrian economics, who knows praxeology, how can this aid him in his historical work? Well, one point that Mises mentions is that the way in which the historian interprets the facts will very much dependent on the views he holds, on the particular theories he holds. He gives, I think, an example. He said, well, supposing we were trying to explain the various witchcraft manias that had taken place, say in the 17th century and elsewhere, he said a historian today wouldn't say that these are to be explained by saying that there were actually women in communication with the devil and that this is how we explain witchcraft. We don't, at least most people don't believe that now, so a historian would have other ways of explaining witchcraft. It's a bit strange he says that because one of the greatest 20th century historians of witchcraft, Montague Summers, did believe just what Mises says that modern historians wouldn't believe. He held to the view that there really were witches. But we can see, even if Mises didn't mention Montague Summers, his point is generally right, that the historian's views are very determined by how the historian interprets facts, very determined by the views he holds. Now we can see this, one example, say we look at the history of the Industrial Revolution in the beginning of the late 18th century in England. Now there were many writers, say beginning with Friedrich Engels, who was Karl Marx's great collaborator. He wrote a book, I think came out in 1844, called The Condition of the English Working Class. He said that the industrial system was really depressed the English working class very much, that conditions were much better before the rise of industrialism. And the famous writer Thomas Carlyle, who was not a Marxist but a romantic socialist, had a similar view. He was the one who coined the phrase for economics, the dismal science. So these writers, who were very influential, said the Industrial Revolution has been very bad for the workers. Now, supposing, though, you know Austrian economics, then you'll know that capitalism is the most productive system possible. So if you hold that view, you'll be very reluctant to accept this picture of the Industrial Revolution. When you're looking at the facts, you'll try to see a different interpretative framework. And in fact, if we have the correct economic theory, we can look at the historical facts in a different way. We can say that population was increasing very much in the 18th century, and it was true that conditions for the workers were, say, in the period of 1760 to end of the French, say through the Napoleonic Wars, were not very good for workers, but they would have been even worse had the previous system still been in existence. That system wasn't able to sustain the larger population at all. It was only because of capitalism that these workers were alive in the first place. And in the 19th century, the standard of life of workers continued to rise, and so the view of the Industrial Revolution postulated by the anti-capitalists was completely wrong. I recommend there are a number of good works on Industrial Revolution, but I think Mises gives a very good short account of Industrial Revolution in Human Action. There's a long footnote, a long discussion, I think, goes from around page 613 to 619 in the Scholars edition. So I think everybody should read that. But that's really, so if you could see how the Mises views on Industrial Revolution. Now, another example is say, in the interpretation of the depression, U.S. depression in beginning in October 1929. Now, there's say one's views on the depression will be very much influenced by what kind of economic theory you have. Say the monetarists, the Chicago economists, think that the depression began because of a contraction of the money supply by the Federal Reserve System. They say, well, the Federal Reserve System made a very bad mistake. They suddenly deflated the currency, and that this is really responsible for the depression. This was really what was at fault. But this goes completely against the Austrian view, where the Austrian view is that the depression was really the response to the inflationary boom of the 1920s, that there had been an expansion of the money supply causing the monetary rate of interest to fall below the natural rate, and then this led to an overextension of the higher stage of production. And then when the expansion stopped, then these projects were shown to be bad investments, so they collapsed, and this accounts for the depression. So this is an example of how the historian can use praxeology to explain history, and more generally how the historian's views will be influenced by the theory he holds. So I think I think I'll stop at this point and have time for questions, comments, objections, refutations. Yeah.
Marxism has been criticized for just holding a monocausal theory of history. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think.
Could you repeat the question? Okay.
Oh, he wants me to say. Yes, the question was that Marxism has sometimes been criticized for being a monocausal theory of history, and would I comment on that? Well, I think there is a great deal to that criticism. In fact, that was one of the points I was trying to bring out when I said on this point about where Marx says the forces of production are the ultimate determinants of history, that this is, Marx is really saying that everything is really to be traced back to this one factor development, force of production. And then, of course, Mises criticizing. Now, it wouldn't follow, though, that the theory is wrong just because it says there's one dominant cause in history. I mean, supposing it turned out that that theory was right, I mean, I don't think there's any general principle that there can't be a monocausal theory of some important phenomenon. It's just a matter, is it the theory right or not? But so I think this point to stress is that the particular Marxist theory is wrong. It's not that it's monocausal that makes it wrong. It is wrong. Now, Marx doesn't, I mean, he does allow also there's interactions between the superstructure and base. So he wouldn't claim that the determination is completely one way all the time. Engels has a famous letter where he says, well, it's the ultimate fact. He doesn't really make clear what ultimate is. But so I say, in brief, I usually go on too long in these things, but the basic thing is you're right that Marxism is to a large extent monocausal, but that doesn't make it incorrect. It's just that it's the wrong, its theory is wrong, but that's something else. Yeah.
Now, does he just criticize other theories, or does he have a overreaching theory of history of his own?
Well, he doesn't have a theory of history in the sense that he has some sort of universal pattern that he thinks applies. It isn't that he has his own version of development of history that he wants to replace Marxism with. He thinks there's a general science of human action, and he hopes that people will be able to apply this to institute capitalism. He doesn't have his own system. One of his students, Eric Voegelin, was also a philosopher of history. Mises doesn't talk about his system, although he thought highly of Voegelin. His system is found in the 5-volume work called Order in History. Probably the reason Mises doesn't talk about him is that Voegelin's views were quite compatible with capitalism, so he doesn't mention that. I think if you wanted to see a system of history that's, if you like that sort of thing, you want to look at a system of history that's compatible with capitalism, you should look at Voegelin's book. Yes, I used to know him. He was an amazingly erudite scholar, one of the most learned people I've ever met. Yes?
Yeah, if we accept methodological individualism, and if we accept only human can act, so every time we say government interferes of life, it makes no sense because government cannot act.
Oh, the question was, if one accepts methodological individualism, would it follow that it makes no sense to criticize government interventionism because government can't act? It's only individuals can act. Oh, but you see, what the methodological individualist view is that when you say some entity other than individuals are acting, like governments are acting, this is to be analyzed by actions of particular individuals. So if you say government intervenes, it means particular people have passed laws of various kinds, and these have had effect. It wouldn't be that you can't make any statement. It isn't saying that governments don't exist. It's just saying how that statement's to be analyzed. So you certainly wouldn't want to say that. You would just analyze the statement in terms of actions of individuals. You would just be saying, when you say the government acts, it doesn't mean there's some body called the government apart from the particular people in it who are acting. Walter?
In my view, Mises is 99% correct in the Mises-Marx debate, and to be charitable, Marx is 1%, although don't ask him for the 1%. Given that, assuming that that's true, what's your analysis or what's your explanation as to why Marx is much more popular than Mises in terms of adherence by intellectuals or by lay people?
Well, the question was, if Mises, is, compared to Marx, is at least 99% correct, why is it that Marxism is much more popular than Mises' system? I think here we would have to appeal, we could give it sort of a somewhat Marxist slant, we appeal to the interests of particular intellectuals. You see, these ideas are what is the best economic system or what is the best interpretation of history. The way people get their ideas, most people get their ideas, is from what they've eventually gotten through particular writers, they're particular influential thinkers, and these ideas gradually percolate down to the public. So opposition to capitalism has been in the interests of particular groups that Murray Rothbard used to call these the court intellectuals. It's sort of very much the advantage of certain people to promote the government because they'll get rewards, they can get great positions for this, and then say people in revolutionary positions will be able to lead, revolutionary movements will be able to get a position of leadership they perhaps couldn't get on the free market. I think there's also, I mean, it's somewhat of it's a very difficult question, but I think it's somewhat, at the time capitalism developed, it just happened to be there were a lot of influential opponents, and once these movements got started, it was very difficult to attack them. The remedies that Mises proposed, the capitalist views he held, weren't acceptable to the governments because they said the government can't do anything, it just has to let the market forces prevail. So I think it's in part the interest of intellectuals, in part just a contingent matter of the way history is developed. But I don't really have a good answer. It's a much better question than my answer. Matthew.
A related question is that if you consider that Marx generally is looking to capture the imagination of groups around class struggle, and mentioned Spengler, and Spengler is thinking in terms of the rise and fall of nations and cultures, but he clearly has a nationalist bent in some respects, or nationalists have found his ideas valuable. It doesn't seem that there is a clear constituency for Mises' view of history other than economists, and to the extent that human action describes the market, where many different choices can be made, and you know, through the market there'll be correct decisions and incorrect decisions. Who is the solid constituency for Mises to build a mass movement?
The question was that Marx and Spengler were to some extent appealing to various classes or nations, but that so they had a constituency for their movement, but that there wouldn't be a constituency for Mises. So wouldn't this prevent him from getting, the Austrians from getting a mass movement started? Well, I suppose Mises could say that the capitalist system is in the interests of the great majority, or the overwhelming majority of people. We want to achieve peace and prosperity, which most people do want. Nearly everyone does want. The only way to do this is through free enterprise capitalism, so that if people can be brought to understand this, that we would have a very big constituency for capitalism. But of course, that's the difficult task. That's why we have the Mises Institute. Anyone else? Yeah.
I have another question. There's an interpretation of the Marx theory by Hannah Arendt in her book *The Human Condition*. She said, in a classical economics, there's a vital assumption that is the harmony of the interest. But Marx pointed out that there's a conflict of interest of the members in the society. So what's your comment on that?
The question was that Hannah Arendt, in her book *The Human Condition*, says that there's the classical economists said there was a harmony of interest, but that Marx had disagreed with this and said there's a conflict of interest. Well, you're certainly right that Marx thought there was a conflict of interest in capitalism mainly between the work of the proletariat and the capitalists. Hannah Arendt is certainly right to say that, but I think that she seems to suggest that Marx was right in what he said, but I don't think this is true, that in the free market there isn't a conflict of interest among people. Everyone, remember, exchanges in the free market take place only if all people who engage in them want to do so. So there's really a harmony of interest, not a conflict. Well, I think we're out of time, so thanks very much.